Rope Trick is among the strangest spells in D&D. It essentially makes a rope stand on end, creating a pocket dimension at the top which can fit up to 8 normal-sized creatures inside. But in 5th edition the spell is so poorly worded and the rules so loose that any use case of Rope Trick tends to be subject to extensive lawyering and delays at the table. As opposed to some folks who think this spell can Mary Poppins an individual straight to the moon or act as a 60-foot long rope crane, I've done the work, and I think I finally understand this spell. And yes, this video does need to be as long as it is. We'll start with the spell itself. It is a 2nd level transmutation spell that requires 1 action to cast. To cast it, you must touch a length of rope that is up to 60 feet long. But what is rope? Rope is a structure formed when fibers, wires, or strips of fabric or material are braided or twisted together in multiple layers to form one coherent object. When rope is cut, it tends to fray and unbraid itself, meaning that any length of rope 1 to 5 feet long is at risk unless made specially or cut with a hot knife or sealed with some material like wax. The smaller you cut a piece of rope, the more likely it is to untwist or unbraid. And so those 1-inch pieces of rope that players sometimes like to lawyer their way into using would be very, very prone to this exact problem, making them impractical for use in this spell, and also, of course, impractical for regular use. The spell requires verbal, somatic, and material components, which consist of powdered corn extract and a twisted loop of parchment. Parchment shouldn't be that hard to acquire, but it does mean, amusingly, that in a hyper-simulationist, medieval European-styled fantasy world, this spell could not be cast as corn comes over in the Columbian Exchange, decidedly very near the end or post the medieval period. The spell lasts an hour and is available to wizards, artificers, and any class that is capable of casting wizard spells alongside in a Bard's Magical Secrets and the Gloomstalker Ranger. So what does this spell actually do? Well, on touching the rope, one end rises into the air until the rope hangs perpendicular to the ground. This sentence is often wildly misinterpreted. I have seen a certain popular video which implies that if this spell is cast on sloped ground, the rope will never be perpendicular to the ground and so will continue to rise into the air infinitely. Firstly, I feel this is a misinterpretation of what magic does. The spell, when cast, quite literally causes the rope to rise into the air until it is perpendicular to the ground. There is no mention of the rope continuing to adhere to gravitational norms. In my view, the rope does not dangle, it hangs fixed in the air, pointing perpendicularly at the ground. If you cast this in Gehenna, for example, where the ground is almost always at a 45-degree angle to you, the rope will rise into the air until it is pointing perpendicularly at the ground. It's how the magic works. Besides, expecting the rope to stay perfectly vertical is a ludicrous interpretation anyway, as this requires perfectly flat ground for the spell to ever function as intended. I mean, even if a wizard is able to find a perfectly flat 0-degree incline upon which to stand to cast this spell, if the rope is not immune to natural forces at this time, then surely the wind might take this 60-foot length of rope and blow it so that the rope never actually ends up in alignment with the ground. So not only can this spell not be cast on any incline whatsoever, you can't even cast it on a mildly windy day. Hence my earlier statement that interpreting the spell in this manner is ludicrous. However, there are more fair criticisms of this perpendicular to the ground wording. Clearly, we need some ground for the rope to hang perpendicularly to. This does not mean that airborne creatures can't cast the spell, as long as there's ground somewhere underneath them. But this does raise problems in certain environments. Which way is the ground in space? In the astral sea. You can solve the problem by just going with the last ground-like object interacted with by the caster, or the object of greatest mass nearby, as D&D has some very strange spatial travel rules. But when you're in deep, empty space, or floating aimlessly in the astral plane, there's no up, there's no down, and there's no ground. At this point, it's on the DM to choose whether you pick a random direction, go by the character's own orientation, meaning the rope will be standing up essentially next to them, or simply make the spell fail. Personally, in my world, anyone creating pocket dimensions while in the astral sea is likely to get a visit from a dreadnought at some point soon. But there's another problem with the rope rising into the air and pointing at the ground. You may have caught it. What if there's no air? This is a really annoying wording because not only does it imply that the spell is useless in space, for example, but also that it is useless in water as well. The intention of this wording, I believe, is to ensure that the rope is definitely blocked by any impassable barrier, like roofs, stone, or ceilings. In my mind, water is generally considered an acceptable permeable substitute for air, especially on planes where that's the only option. But in technicality, it does require a rope trick to move up through air. So again, Game Master discretion. But once your rope is hanging in the air is when the magic really happens. Rope trick is based on an old street magician's trick, which in its most complex outings involves throwing a rope into the air, which then stands on end. The rope is then climbed, usually by the magician's assistant, who vanishes completely at the top. The magician, angered by this disappearance and unresponsiveness, climbs the rope as well, vanishing additionally, until the audience sees severed limbs dropping out of this vanishing point. The magician then descends the rope, reappearing to the audience as he does, before gathering up the limbs and reconstituting his apprentice in some bag or box, much to the delight and amazement of the onlookers. It's certainly a remarkable and memorable act involving two disappearances, one reappearance, a magical rope, and some way over the top violence. But the spell is designed to replicate this trick. We have our standing rope, but how does the wizard disappear? Well, at the upper end of the rope, an invisible entrance opens to an extra-dimensional space that lasts until the spell ends. Great. But that raises more questions. In what sense is this entrance invisible? What precisely is an extra-dimensional space? And how big is this entrance anyway? Unfortunately for our purposes, these questions are surprisingly tough to answer. The invisible condition in 5th edition applies effects only to creatures. But the Sea Invisibility spell does tell us that objects can be invisible too, even if there is legitimately no way for a player to make an object invisible in the game. So what would someone who can see invisibility see? Most likely a simple shaped entrance in 2-dimensional plane outlined with magic. They cannot see beyond the entryway, but they can observe the limits of the portal's size. Unlike the reader of this spell, who is given no indication as to what the size of the entrance is. The only useful measurement we get in the entire spell is the size of the viewing window, the window out of which people inside the extra-dimensional space can see. It is a 3-foot by 5-foot window facing the ground, centered on the rope. But this viewing window isn't real. The folks inside see the outside world as if through this 3-foot by 5-foot window, which again points towards the ground. But in the absence of any other information, this 3-foot by 5-foot window centered on the rope in the center works well enough for me as the shape and size of the entrance. Although this does mean that from certain approaches, this entrance would only be 1.5 feet wide, which would require most small and medium creatures to squeeze to get inside. One could rule that this hole has a radius of 2.5 feet centered upon the rope, which would alleviate this situation where one's angle of approach matters. Especially since without the ability to see the entrance, a creature cannot pick for itself the widest part of this strange rectangular entryway. But where does this entryway lead? An extra-dimensional space. First off, there is no definition of what that means in any 5th edition book. The closest we get is a description of what demiplanes are. The DMG clarifies that demiplanes are a form of extra-dimensional space. Demiplanes can range from, quote, as small as a chamber to the size of a realm. And the description of demiplanes goes on to cite Mordenkainen's Magnificent Mansion as one such example, despite the spell itself claiming that the mansion is an extra-dimensional dwelling. In sum, then, although a demiplane is a type of extra-dimensional space, it is likely that there is some semantic difference, and it is likely that this semantic difference lies in how big said extra-dimensional space is. Extra-dimensional spaces can be any size, from a wrist pocket containing a single bead to Barovia. But to call it a demiplane, I would argue it should be larger than 30 by 30 feet. The size of the demiplane spell's conjured space. So it is likely that Rope Trick's extra-dimensional space is smaller than this, not least because Rope Trick is a 2nd level spell and demiplane is a little bit higher. But we can't assume to know exactly what it looks like. What we do know is that it stands outside the plane it was cast from, hence extra-dimensional, in its own little fold of reality. Therefore, you can almost certainly interpret it as significantly hampering, if not outright blocking, single-plane teleportation, communication, or divination magic. It does, however, mean that interplanar teleportation magic, such as plane shift, can be used from inside a Rope Trick, even used to target the very plane upon which Rope Trick was first cast. But we must get back to defining what this interior space looks like. The only indication we have on what this place is like is that it can hold as many as 8 medium or smaller creatures. This to me might indicate that the spell could be malleable in its size, as having a limit of 8 tiny creatures seems strange when we can fit 8 6-foot-tall people inside. We should, however, take 8 medium creatures to be the upper limit of this space, whether it grows with them or not. Otherwise, there's not a brilliant reason for a GM to deny a 9th medium creature squeezing inside, except perhaps that the spell's designer thought that 8 needed to be the limit. I am aware that this is among the most contentious and least evidenced portions of my argument, and you could certainly suggest that the extra-dimensional space thus created is limitless and boundless, filled with beautiful Doric columns, a grand woodland stretching for infinity, and that the spell merely has a magical limit of 8 creatures taking out into a pocket fold of reality before that pocket of reality collapses. I do like that interpretation, but I do have 2 pieces of evidence to back up the interpretation that the 8 medium creatures limit is, in fact, a space issue. Firstly, we have Lamans Tiny Hut. This spell has a very similar wording when it states that 9 creatures of medium size or smaller can fit in the dome with you. Tiny Hut, for the record, creates a 10-foot radius hemisphere around the caster and their chosen allies, not creating a fold in reality. So, this means that the creators did some variety of maths and came up with the fact that 10 creatures can fit in a 10-foot radius dome. Except that's not the case. Despite explicitly and clearly stating that 9 creatures can fit in the dome with you, the caster, the spell actually fails if there are more than 9 creatures in the area of the hut, or if there's something large in this area. Sometimes these things just make negative sense. We can at least infer from this that Rope Trick's extra-dimensional space is at least slightly smaller than a 10-foot radius dome, as it can hold 1 less person, or 2 fewer if you're a special kind of pedant. Considering the similarity in wording between the 2 spells and the relatively similar and comparable numbers, we can assume that there is some physical limit to the size of the extra-dimensional space created using Rope Trick. Furthermore, although I am aware that sage advice is often spurious and incomplete, I do feel it gives a good insight into designer intent, at least. When asked if a large creature, not just a medium creature, could enter into a Rope Trick's extra-dimensional space, Jeremy Crawford, lead rules designer of D&D 5th edition, stated, "The Rope Trick doesn't prohibit a large creature from entering the spell's extra-dimensional space, since that creature takes up less space than 8 medium creatures." This indicates that there is actually some spatial concern to squeezing all those people inside a small enclosed area, not that the spell has a certain creature limit baked into its very existence. Lamans Tiny Hut has a clause which discusses what happens when you get dozens of tiny creatures under the area. It fails. Or 1 large creature in the region. It fails. But Rope Trick does not. But given all that, what is my estimation for the internal size of a Rope Trick? Well, I think it is a rectangular room that is 20 feet by 12 feet, giving a total surface floor area of 240 square feet. Tiny Hut gives us 314. This at least keeps us in line with the size of the window, just scaling it up from 3 by 5 to 12 by 20. This is pure speculation, but in my mind it seems fair. Please, if you are better at maths than me though, do call me out. So, we finally have some idea of what the Rope Trick looks like on the inside. But how do we get in? The spell description states, the extra-dimensional space can be reached by climbing to the top of the rope, and that the rope can be pulled into the space, making the rope disappear from view outside the space. It seems simple. You get in by climbing the rope, which you can't do if the rope's been pulled in, right? No. The word "can" here is the key. It is indeed one way in, but climbing isn't the only way to enter this entrance, which is a physical, invisible opening suspended in the air, probably measuring either a 2.5 foot radius circle or 3 by 5. You can fly, or jump through the open hole, or stick a limb or a head or a torso through. Even if the rope disappears from view outside of the space, there is no discussion of the entrance ceasing to exist, or ceasing to be, an entrance. If an intelligent creature observes the trick, they may reasonably be cognizant of the space in the air where everyone's gone into, even if the rope has been pulled up. Such a creature may choose to dispel the magic, or ready itself to attack any creature that emerges, or even just jump or fly upwards to get into the entrance itself. But because the entrance states can and not must climb the rope, these options must needs be viable options at least. But this also means that anyone inside can poke a head, limb, or torso, or arm out and make a reasonable attempt at an attack, perhaps while blinded. Using this spell in combat essentially boils down to a game of chicken, where either each side can take a short rest, assuming everyone from one side gets inside the rope trick, one side breaks the deadlock by passing through the entrance, even in some small form as an arm with an axe in it, or alternatively, one or two individuals can hide in here as kind of a sniper's nest when it's not their turn. It's pretty potent if used correctly. But considering that anyone can enter and leave, regardless of if the rope is dangling there or not, there is at least some decent counterplay. The best tactic may seem to be to throw a fireball straight up through the entrance. After all, if your enemies are all up there, and the entrance is open, you're going to be hitting every last one of them, and they've got nowhere to go. But there are two problems with this. One, creatures outside can't see inside the rope trick, and creatures inside can see as if through a window. So there's no actual direct line that a fireball could be fired upon, even if one side can see the other. Two, the spell actually states spells and attacks can't cross through the entrance, into or out of the extra dimensional space. So, no shooting through the entrance, no spell slinging, and I would personally deny any attempt to misty step or dimension door using the sight line to the ground from inside the rope trick. As in our interpretation, that window is analogous to the entrance. That is up to debate, though. In any case, it's not that potent to allow this, because the window is, again, simply looking down at the ground where the rope climbed from. Tiny Hut, Rope Trick's best comparison, blocks all non-permitted creatures, objects, spells, and magical effects from moving into the spell's area. Rope Trick just blocks attacks and spells from crossing through the entrance. This justifies the poke an arm through and cast a spell or swing a weapon absolutely blindly, as well as the sniper tower hidey hole, as long as you can effectively poke in and out of the entrance on your turn. Fireball cannot pass through the entrance, as it is a spell. Spells, as stated in the chapter 10 of the basic rules, are a discrete magical effect, a single shaping of the magical energies that suffuse the multiverse into a specific, limited expression. You hear that? All spells are magical effects, but not all magical effects are spells. Any spell targeted towards the entrance, intended to pass through, simply cannot. However, if we create a magical effect that isn't a spell, and all other conditions for said magical effect's activation are met, it may actually be possible to affect one side from the other without crossing the entrance. The Lich's Disrupt Life legendary action, for instance, targets non-undead creatures within 20 feet. No vision required. If a Lich moves up to the entrance, which it can see using True Sight, it can use this effect on those inside, unless you have specific rules in your game about what an extra dimensional space actually means. In my games, Rope Trick is a fold in space created by the spell right there and then. As such, considering magical effects aren't blocked, it is relatively likely that I would allow this edge case to affect the creatures inside a Rope Trick. Fun fact, even if it did state it blocked magical effects, this would not actually stop a dragon's breath from harming those inside. As, according again to Mr. Crawford, a dragon's breath should not be considered a magical effect, but a biological feature of the creature itself. Additionally, as it is not an object, creature, spell, or magical effect, technically dragon breath even permeates a tiny hut. This is a strange and unnatural ruling though, so I'm going to leave it right there. Of course, you can interpret the spatial dynamics differently, suggesting that instead of a folded pocket in space, Rope Trick creates something of a wormhole, connected to an infinitely distant new plane of existence, created like a bubble on the outside of the universe. Both interpretations are equally valid and depend on how you've got your world set up, and to debate them is essentially to debate sci-fi speculative world building. So we're going to leave it right there. Finally, we have reached the last line of Rope Trick's spell description. It's been a long road. This asserts that anything inside the extra-dimensional space drops out when the spell ends. This is relatively simple, all told. I've made an entire video on how falling works in 5th edition, just in case you've made the horrible mistake of casting this spell very high up in the air. So do go and check that video out if you're interested. And even if you haven't cast it in the air, it's worth being prepared for what happens when your Rope Trick gets dispelled. Wait, can you dispel Rope Trick? After all, you can't see the rope if it is pulled up without true sight or see invisibility. And it's a spell. Dispel magic only targets creatures, objects, or magical effects. Oh no, what are we going to do? Must this video continue forever? No. As stated earlier, thankfully, all D&D spells are magical effects by default. And there's not even a requirement to see the thing you're dispelling with Dispel Magic. All is right in the world. And now, at long last, we know exactly how one of the 524 spells currently in 5th edition works. Thank you so much for watching this spiralling pedantic madness. And special thanks to the party of mine who forced my hand in making this video by spending more time debating this spell than they ever have shopping. You know who you are. If you, for some ungodly reason, want more of this pedantic nonsense, please let me know in the comments or by hitting subscribe. And even if you don't want me to dive into these weeds again, please stay. I promise I don't hyperfixate like this in every video. But with that said, thanks again so much for watching. My name is Tom, otherwise known as the Grungin Master. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video.